In this video I want to show you how the Analog Synth in Ableton Live works and what all those buttons do, can do, or simply mean. And I really want to explain everything to you, but at the same time make sure to make it in the most musical and least technical way, which means I first want to show you what's in my opinion really important for making sounds, to then also showing you the stuff that is also cool, but in my opinion more for like subtle changes. And also check the timestamps in case you already know exactly what you're looking for, and otherwise let's just jump right into it. So when you first open the synth, you get this highly inspiring sound. And at first it's really important to know that the sound generators are called oscillators, and you see them here as OSC1 and OSC2. And if no one of those is selected, there's simply no sound. And also you have some noise oscillator, so it's basically like OSC1 or 2, but instead of creating a pitch, you have some noise. So every individual oscillator is some waveform, and different waveforms sound differently. So if we only select oscillator 1, because this way we can listen more precisely to what's actually happening, we have the sawtooth wave, which is this one, which is nice and present, but you also have some sine wave, which is a little more subtle and mellow. And you have the square wave, which is a bit more aggressive. And also you can select noise for the first oscillator. And here you have a section where you can tune your oscillator, but this one is more important if you're using two oscillators, because let's now activate the second oscillator again. And right now they are tuned in the same way, which sounds a little, I don't know, just dull. But if you, for example, detune the second oscillator, you get this nice analog vintage touch synth sound. And also you can play with the octaves, because for example you can put one oscillator higher for some bigger sound. Or you can play with semitones, which means for example you could use 7 semitones, which is a fifth. And this way you get this kind of big lead type character. Now you see the next stage is a filter, but for now we're going to deselect it because I want to explain to you the amplitude first and the amplitude envelope, because now we still hear our sound. And also the amp is important because if there's no amplitude, there's also no sound. So either there's no oscillator or there's no amplitude. Both means we don't have a sound. So those both things have to be activated. So you can pan it, which is simple. So just right, left. And also you have the level here. So you have to make sure that you're not in the red, basically, or can mix it later with another one. But this is something I'll go to in a second. The most important thing now is that you can set some envelope for your sound, because you hear that if I press a key, it's going to play the sound in a certain way. But here we have some parameters which we can use in order to control this. So for example, we have the attack, which means if it's short, our sound is there right away. If it's long, it takes a while to actually become present. And the decay is basically the time it needs to go to the level you set with the sustain. So for example, if the decay is 2 seconds and the sustain is really low, you can hear that our sound is descending over time. But if the sustain would be all the way up, you wouldn't hear the decay because it just stays on top for the whole time. And also the release is important, because this is like how long the tone rings after you release the key, and if this is really long, you almost have some sort of reverb effect compared to the sound being away right away. What's also really important is the reaction of your amplitude to velocity, and velocity means how hard or soft you play your keys, and it's this value here, and if it's at 4 it's quite strong, because you can hear I can play loudly and softly. And that's a huge difference, and sometimes it can cause some unwanted jumps in your playing. So if you feel like it's a bit unnatural, just lower this value. Next, let's activate our filter again, but first we won't hear any difference. But we will as soon as we decrease the value for the frequency, because if it's all the way to the right, it means the filter is fully open, so it doesn't cut off any frequencies. But if we bring it down, let's say to 100 something, out of a sudden the sound becomes a bit duller, because we took away some frequencies, and that's the basic principle of subtractive synthesis, which means you take a filter to take away frequencies, and this way you shape the sound. Also, the filter has some envelope, because here you see again attack, decay, sustain and release, and it's exactly the same as with the amplitude, just a second way of shaping the sound. And a good way of understanding the filter envelope is to have a different setting for the filter envelope than for the amplitude. So right now our amplitude envelope is very simple because we press a key, it's fully there, we release it, it's gone. And if for the filter envelope we just select some long attack, you will hear that over time the filter gradually opens before it then closes again due to the decay time and going down as much as the sustain determines here. Like this. And also you can increase or decrease the intensity of this filter envelope. So if you want to have this effect stronger, you can just raise this value here. And then you have a very strong filter sound. Sometimes it's cool to bring out more character out of digital synthesizers. And if this is at 0, this means like the filter envelope is not applied at all, and all we do is selecting how bright or dull the sound is with the frequency knob. But there's no movement we can shape through the filter envelope. And next to the frequency we have the resonance, which can just create some additional boost in the frequencies, and sometimes there's some interesting interplay also to where you put the cutoff frequency. So if I increase this, just see what happens to the sound. You also get into the spacey direction, then it gets really nasty if you bring it all the way up to the top. And sometimes you can really look for the sweet spot between the cutoff frequency and the resonance, and also sometimes you find those robotic sounds. Also the way you shape the filter or the envelope has some impact on that, but yeah, lots of stuff to play around with. You almost get some kick drum kind of sound. Now, if you're new to synthesizers, this is basically all you need to know at first, and just with those few settings, you can spend the next weeks just experimenting how they affect each other, what happens if you change certain parameters, because this is like the basic setup of some classic analog synthesizer. However, you also saw that I left out a good bunch of things that you already saw on the screen because I wanted to focus on those real basics first, but now we're going to look at them in more detail. If you click on one of those oscillators, you see something called pitch envelope, and here you can add some movement to the way the pitch moves once you press the key. So just see what happens if I increase the pitch envelope here all the way to the top. You get this kind of space sound, and you can also determine how long this is going to be, like short or longer. And it's really important for drum sounds. I'll just quickly show you some example. Now I've just created some super simple little kick drum because you see the pitch envelope is at 94%, a little bit of time, and then the amplitude envelope is really short, and I pitched it down a little, but this way we almost have some little kick drum. Then there are some more settings on the bottom, and let's start with sub-sync, because it means you can either add some sub-oscillators, so which means here we have like 2 oscillators and 1 noise oscillator, but we can make it 4 oscillators if we add like some sub-oscillator for both of them. And it basically means that we get some bassy sub, like if we have our basic sound and we increase the amount, you hear that we get this kind of bass tone. And instead of using a sub, we can also select sync. And for sync, you have to understand that with classic synthesizers, there was always the way that between 2 oscillators, you could use the detune freely, which means you can really create some out-of-tune sounds, but you could also use a sync setting, and it's not available for this analog synth here in the classic way, which would mean if sync is selected, you can't detune because they will always be in sync in their tone. And in this case, the detune button would just change the timbre, but here it doesn't work like it. But what's available on this synth is that if you increase the sync amount, it kind of imitates the timbre that creates if you use this effect. But if it sounds too abstract, just think of it as some timbre switch where you can just see where you like the sound the most. Those tones are good for bell sounds, for example, but yeah, you have a lot of choices. Then you have the pulse width, and for this one you have to select the square wave, otherwise you can't use it. And you can basically say how large this kind of wave is going to be, or the interval of this kind of frequency that is going to be created. And again, if it's too abstract, just listen. It basically also just changes the timbre. from really thin to really thick. And the same counts for the pitch modulation, the LFO, I'll explain in a second. But here with the key setting, you basically say that it reacts to your keyboard notes. So if it's on 100%, it basically translates the pitches of your MIDI keyboard onto those actual notes. But you can also change those. Like if it's at 0, you can play the same note everywhere, no matter where you press. Or you can try experimenting with places somewhere in between, and you can also go above 100, but then you just leave those classic intervals, and maybe you feel like experimenting with it. I've never used it, to be honest. Before going to the LFO, just quickly about the noise. So here you can basically just determine the color, and the more you turn this to the left, the duller the sound is, or the kind of less high frequency content you can hear, and the more you increase it, the brighter it gets. And here you can set the amount of volume, and those F1, F2 kind of things I'll also mention in a second. By the way, in case you feel like this is kind of all interesting and you're getting the vibe and you kind of learn about synthesizers, but it would just be nice to have this one overall once and for all information on how they work. And it's not like specifically for one synth, because often if you look at another one, it's going to be confusing again. I just want to invite you to check out a class that I made about synthesizer basics and all the important stuff you need to know. And it's not about one specific synth. It's like some overall description and also some overall class that just teaches you all the basics in about 1 hour. And there's a link down below in the description, also including some little discount code, and you're warmly invited to check it out. Because first I want to explain LFOs to you, and in order to use them you have to activate them. You have 2 of them, as you can see here, and it stands for low frequency oscillator, and it's basically a frequency you can't hear but you can use for modulating sounds. Again, if it's too abstract. As an example, here you have the first oscillator, and once you select some LFO you can see that you can actually increase the value here. And the most simple example is to apply it to the pitch. So if we select a very low rate, which means the LFO is oscillating at a very slow speed, and we apply this to our oscillator 1 pitch, just see what happens. So you see that with the waveform of the LFO, which is some sine wave, but here it doesn't look like one because the rate is so slow. Actually, this way you can see it better. We just move up and down in pitch. And the faster you set the rate, the faster it's going to be. And at some high rates, it almost can sound a little distorted. Although those LFOs don't go so fast, so here you don't get this distorted character yet. And again, for the LFOs, you have different waveforms here. Rectangular is kind of comparable to square wave, not exactly the same, but a similar concept, which is why you can also change the width. And so you see here we don't get those smooth changes, but we get some more aggressive kind of direct change, more rhythmical. And here you can actually see what the square wave is doing. Retrigger basically means that all the time you press a note, it starts the LFO anew. Compared to if it's not selected, the LFO kind of oscillates freely. Let's actually try some example and make it really slow. Maybe move back to the sine wave. So now if I started pressing a key, you see that it always starts on different positions, whereas when I use the retrigger function, it always sounds the same when I press the key. And with the offset you can basically just change this position, and you have to listen to if this improves something for your sound. Basically you can say with what kind of sound you want to start, for example, if the retrigger is selected. And what's really useful is that, for example, with the delay, you can say the LFO doesn't come in immediately, because you want to have the first impact of the sound in a clean way and then have another layer come in through the LFO. I mean, this is now really extreme, but you could also use the attack, for example, because this way it gently increases the tension. I mean, this is now just some very extreme examples so you understand it, but I always like those because sometimes the LFO can sound too extreme if it's there right away, but then you might want to experiment with using attack and delay. And if you're using square waves, you can also use the LFO to modulate the pulse width. So if I increase this, that's kind of a cool effect because this way it morphs through those different positions and your sound becomes a bit more active. So this is actually something I really like to use. And also with the LFOs, you can either use the rate in hertz. So you see it's like 1 hertz or 2 hertz, or basically measurable in hertz. And you can also make it rhythmical. So in this case, we could have the pulse width modulation happen in like 16th notes. It's more obvious actually with the pitch. I mean, this is now not sounding great, but just, you can sync this in rhythm. And this way have some, for example, some moving bass lines or this kind of stuff. And also what's important to know is that you also have some noise waveforms that again create some irregular kind of pattern that is cool if you like some random effects. And also be known that if you apply some LFO to the pitch, it's called vibrato. Though in analog you also have some designated vibrato on the right side, and here it also sounds better, because somehow if you do it with the LFO, it sounds a little too harsh. I don't know why actually. Compared to this kind of soft vibrato, which basically also is just some LFO to the pitch, but maybe some slightly adjusted waveform for the synth. But it's really great for adding this analog touch. I almost always use it. Let's continue looking at some additional envelope settings, and I deselected the filter for now, so we can just listen to the amplitude envelope, because they are actually the same for filter and amplitude envelope. And for example, here next to sustain, you see sustain time, which is basically a setting that adds some additional decay to the sustain. So if it's on infinite, your note just keeps present all the time. But if you put this, for example, to 3.5 seconds, you see here that actually your sustain decays, although it's the sustain. And honestly, I never used it, but just what it means. You can also make your attack react to velocity, which means if you increase this one, you can have some extremely present attack when you play with high velocity. It's going to be a bit loud now. But also some soft kind of attack if you play with low velocity. It's very subtle, but can be kind of cool, and I like this because it's a very gentle setting. Then it's also good to know that you have exponential and linear curves. So exponential means that, this one means that your sound is present quicker, and then those last bits are less strong in terms of how much you hear the movement. Let's just make some attack of maybe 4 seconds. Compared to the linear curve, that is just the same intensity of ascension all the time. Might be a bit smoother in some situations. It's also important to know about legato, because if it's not selected, it means it re-triggers our envelope all the time we press the key. But if it's on legato, it means it picks it up at the value where it's set while the new key is pressed. And a good example would be to increase the release. Maybe we need some shorter attack, and I'm going to show you the MIDI grid so you can see what kind of note I press. So now I press this note. And if I press it again, it always picks it up at the value where it's at, compared to when legato is deselected, it always re-triggers the whole envelope. And this way it almost sounds like some sidechain effect. And sometimes it can happen that when you make a sound, you get this weird kind of cut-off motion. And then you should always check your envelopes, because maybe the only thing you need to do is select legato for the amplitude envelope in this case. And if you select free, you basically bypass the sustain, because this is some setting that is particularly good for drum sounds. So let's say we have a sound with 100% sustain and the decay is like 200 milliseconds. Just see what happens. Although I press the key, you see that it basically ignores the sustain. And yeah, again, for percussion sounds, also with those pitch envelopes, this can be useful, because this way you make sure it never reacts to sustain, although you may press the note a little longer sometimes. It just always will have the same kind of envelope. Another fun setting is the loop setting, although this one I also never use, but nevertheless it's fun, because you can tell the synth to loop for as long as you hold the key. So in this case, AD means attack decay. So it repeats the attack decay phase until you release, and then it's going to be the release. So if I press a key, it just keeps playing until I release the key. And then you have some other mode. In this one, you basically also add the release to this cycle, so it's a little longer. And as soon as you make some of those longer, the whole kind of motion will be longer. Kind of fun. And also you can then use this one where you also add the attack to the actually release phase, so it triggers once more after you release, which is kind of also weird but fun. But again, I never use those, but I always feel like there must actually be some cool situation where this could be fun to use. But yeah, maybe you find it. Let me know in the comments down below. And then on the bottom row, it's basically the same principle as with the oscillator section, that you can apply modulations to parameters of, in this case, the amplitude section. So if you activate the LFO, you can apply it to the panning, so it will just move around in the stereo field, which is also, or can be, some cool tremolo effect. You can also modulate the pan by some keyboard tracking, which means if you increase this, your lower notes will be more on one side, in this case left, and your higher notes on the right side. If you like this, I also never used this, but this is how it works. And then again, you can say how much the envelope actually impacts the panning. So if you increase this one, and now I made some envelope with like a 4-second decay, you can actually see that the sound moves a little from right to left. And next to it, it's just the same, just for the level. And LFO applied to the level always sounds a bit like some tremolo. It's also possible with applying it to the filter envelope. I'll show this to you in a second. But you get this kind of nice wobbly sound. And again, you can also do this with the keyboard tracking, that if you play some lower note, it will actually be softer than some higher note. But again, this I like for the filter envelope, but not necessarily for the amplitude. By the way, in case you're interested, I'm also about to release my first ever Ableton Live sound pack with sounds made with Analog, Wavetable and Operator, but all in a very open-minded way, so you can easily modify them and make your own versions out of it, and it's highly encouraged to do so. And if you're interested in that, you can find a link down below in the description, also including a little discount code. Then on the filter section, it's mostly the same stuff, like the envelope things are exactly the same. Then you can also apply some velocity to the envelope intensity, which is cool if you want to have some more impact on what you can do by playing. So if I do this, I can play with a soft velocity, and I'm going to close the filter a little. And a higher velocity, and this is some extreme example, but this can actually add, if you add it subtly, it can add some nice touch to your expression possibilities on your keyboard. So usually I have this on like a very tiny amount. And again, the LFO to the filter is also some sort of tremolo. Maybe a bit smoother as a tremolo than if you do it to the amplitude, but it also depends on where you have the filter frequency. It's always like some interplay and balancing. And here the keyboard tracking can also be cool, because it means like the lower you play, the less the filter will open. And for lower notes, this helps sometimes because it makes them sound a little more dark and mysterious, and your playing gets some nice opening motion once you go to higher notes. And again, it's great if you add this a little, not like too much, but if you kind of play some live. I mean, this is a very banal example again, but this way your playing just gets a little more dynamic, and I'm really into adding small bits of dynamic response on different parts rather than adding one thing like with a huge amount. And I already told you about the envelope intensity, that I find this really important. Then you have something called drive, which is basically some different algorithms for how the filter sounds. And the higher you go, the louder it is, and the more you can actually get some, as it says, drive, overtones, frequency content. It just sounds bigger and larger. But mostly you'll hear a difference in the volume. And you have to play around with this to kind of find how it reacts to also your filter settings. There's a lot of cool stuff to find, but I always like to start with something like Sim 1 or Sim 2 or ASIM 1, ASIM 2 to just have some more character together with also the intensity of the filter envelope. Then for the filters you have different modes. Right now it's on LP24, which is a low pass filter with a slope of 24 decibel per octave, which means it's quite steep, and it means it takes away high frequency content, as you've seen. And you can also have a low pass 12 dB filter that is less intense. So if it's at this setting, for example, you can hear that the 12 filter has more high frequency content than the 24 type filter. It's just steeper. And band pass is this kind of thing that just has both taken low frequencies and high frequencies off, so it's a bit thinner. And you also have this in different intensities. Not just like a band pass, but the other way around, so it just takes out frequencies at one particular point. This is also why this is more present compared to the bandpass filter, because the bandpass filter takes away so much. And also you have this just in different intensities. And then you have high pass, which is like low pass, just the other way around. So this way you take away the low frequency content. And again, you can do this in 2 different intensities. And then the formant is just some, I don't want to make it sound too complicated. Basically, it's just some filter that is very charismatic with some particular timbre that often gives you those voice type effects. Also, if you work with resonance and frequency, you get some super cool effects out of this one. Also like some nice resonances. And then there's also the routing for the filters, and I'm going to speak about this section in the end, but we have to look at the routing already, because you see right now we always used 1 or 2 oscillators, whatever we were using, and we're sending it into one filter and one amplitude, but you have another filter and another amplitude, which means that basically you can treat 2 oscillators on completely individual paths. So if you use this quick routing, it means that we have oscillator 1 in this path and oscillator 2 in the other path. And in order to realize this, it's kind of cool to pan the first oscillator to the right side and the second oscillator to the left side, so you can see how they are being treated differently. And let's just make a very simple sound for our first oscillator that is just going to have some classic direct attack. And for our second sound, we're going to use some long attack, sorry. Actually, this video is taking quite some time, so forgive me if I have some typos sometimes. And now you should be able to hear that also if we close the filter of the second one, that we hear the first oscillator right away on the right side, while the other one is going to morph in on the left side. Which is actually super cool, and if you're into making more complex sounds, you want to work with panning, there are lots of options here. I don't use it so much until now, I must say. I'm always using it for more simple sounds, but there's a lot of potential for sure. And this way you can also again modulate like panning individually and so many options. And then you can also mix, because here you see that you have a selection for F1 or F2, but you can also mix in between, so you don't have to, it's not like some either or choice. So you can just make it 50-50 on both, and this way just combine the timbres a little more. And if you press follow on the second filter, it's just going to follow the cutoff frequency of the first one. So sometimes if it gets too wild, you can this way control your sound as a whole a little more again. And you can use those quick routings, they help in order to get started, but there's nothing you can only do by quick routing, because you can also do it manually. Here you see that they get mixed and get sent into both filters, and then the amplitudes are individual again. But you can always play with it. You can also then still send filter 1 to filter 2, but just be aware that as soon as you deselect amplitude 2, it doesn't have any impact, because filter 2 is not audible if amplitude 2 is deselected. And now we can check the menu on the right side, which is basically the settings menu of the synth, where you have all the basic settings. And the most important one would be the one for voices, because with real synthesizers there's usually some restriction in the amount of voices, and just because we have some digital synth we can have like a 32 voice polyphony, but with real synthesizers, hardware synthesizers, it's not uncommon that you would have like some 4-note polyphony, which means if you play 4 notes, as soon as you play the 5th note, it's going to take one of those other notes away. And you can see this when I open the MIDI grid and I play 1 note in the bass, and now 3 more, a little higher, and if I play a 5th note, it's going to take away the bass note. So this is what happens. But you can set some priority here, which means if it's last, it means it always prioritizes the last notes you played. So because the bass note was the first one, it takes this one away immediately. But you can also say that it's, for example, that the priority is like on low, which means that it prioritizes notes that are in the lower registers. So if I do the same again, now it actually keeps my lowest note and replaces another one for it. And you can also do it the other way around by high, which means it would prioritize the higher notes and in this way again take the low note away. And for the voices, it's also really good to know that usually when you create bass sounds, you would select some mono setting, because this way you don't have polyphony, and with bass sounds it can sound always a bit nasty if notes overlap due to some release or something. And like this, you can see that if I press a note and press another one, it's only going to play the second note and going to take away the first note. And especially for bass sounds, but also for lead sounds, I can highly recommend that. Here you can also globally detune or tune your synth if that's necessary for making it work with maybe another recording or instrument, like with the octave, semitones and detune. It's the same as you have here for the oscillators. And also you have those stretch and error settings which give you, it's like some analog touch kind of thing, because error means that it just doesn't put the notes as sharp as they would usually be by digital terms all the time. So if it's on 100%, it will sound a bit out of tune sometimes. You can hear it here. And can be kind of cool. Also, you might want to experiment with it if you already recorded something and then you maybe automate the error button, or you just play around with it in order to add this kind of analog touch. It can work quite nicely. And with the stretch setting, you can say that if you increase the amount, the high notes will be tuned a bit sharper and the low notes a bit flatter, which just makes your sound a little more tense. Like if you listen to this, you also feel like there's a certain type of detune in it, while if you do it the other way around, they are going into the other direction, so not as sharp and not as flat. So they are kind of closer together if you think of like a set of notes, and both things just cause, again, some detune effect that can also sound like some analog error in some analog instrument. PB range is just like your pitch bend range, so if you have this all the way to 12 with your pitch bend, it means that you can go some octave higher. So now I just play one note and use the pitch bend. And otherwise 2 is fine, but you can always fine-tune this if you need to use the pitch bend for some certain effect. And also some more settings for the vibrato, so you can also access the vibrato through the mod wheel if this is on 100%. So now I'm going to use my mod wheel, otherwise it wouldn't react. And also you can say that it comes a little later with the attack and delay. It's exactly the same way as it was for the LFO. And error just means that, again, this frequency has some errors, and another button that can give you those nice little inaccuracies that usually it's fun to play with. And yeah, now you can see that the vibrato comes in a little later. Added to the vibrato, you also have unison detune, which basically means that it creates some additional voices and some nice chorusing sound. And here you can also select if you want to use 2 or 4 voices. So 4 voices is going to be bigger. And if you increase this amount, you just get lots of detuned timbres that can be super cool, especially for big sounds, for leads. So here is, for example, it's a very nice chorus effect, and if you use more voices, it just sounds bigger and more intense. And also for the unison, you can add the delay, and it's exactly the same as with the LFO or the vibrato delay. So sometimes it's just nice to bring in the sound a little later. And glide is a little like some pitch envelope because it kind of slides to the pitch you actually press on your keyboard. It's most audible in mono mode if you only have a mono synth, which is always the setting you use for bass sounds, for example, or most of the time, or for lead sounds. So you can nicely slide from one note to the next note. And if you increase this amount, it's just going to be some longer slide. And when you press legato, you can have some more impact on the way you play, because I have to show you the MIDI grid. If I press the notes and there's a gap in between, it doesn't trigger the glide, but if a note is pressed and I press the other one before releasing the previous one, I have the glide. So this way you have more expression possibilities during playing. Also for the glide you have two different modes. It's not such a huge difference in my opinion. It's just that it reacts proportionally to the space between your notes. This is something you really have to check for whatever figure you're playing. If you're interested in some practical examples on how to use analog, I'm going to link you a playlist here containing lots of sound design tutorials about making sounds with a synthesizer. Also, once more, warm invitation to check out this class and this sound pack that I mentioned during this video. And apart from that, I just wish you lots of inspiration with whatever it is that you create and really hope to see you soon again at this channel. Bye!